Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan, and we'll be spending the next couple of hours talking to the guides about ancient civilizations and wisdom we can apply to our day-to-day lives. If you are watching us on YouTube and you're seeing ads on this video, you can watch us ad-free on Rumble or any number of podcast platforms. On Rumble, just search for AAE, or Awaken Empowered Podcast on Apple or Spotify or any number of other podcast platforms as well. As I always say in these shows, I don't discuss these questions with Micheila ahead of time, just so our conscious mind doesn't interfere with the channeling, even though she is a trance channel, so we will be speaking directly to the guides, so we'll be getting answers directly from them. So whenever you're ready, we can get started. Mm-hmm. And who's with us today?
We consider ourselves a council of many who have assembled for the purpose of these transmissions, knowing, of course, that questions will be asked about various dimensional realities and historic timelines. However, you can consider us all somewhat representative of the Council of Light, the 12th dimension. We are all lending our Akashic history and our wisdom to this collective in their support of the expansion of the entire universe.
Is this any different than the councils that we've been speaking with in previous shows?
What councils do is assemble themselves according to a certain purpose or assignment. And while many would like to define councils using a name or a specific race, they are almost always in a quantum fashion coming together for a specific and momentary purpose. Now, the Council of Light is a council organized of many interdimensional beings that have evolved through the 12th dimension. And while we can say that this council is always evolving, and there are many that are lending its wisdom and information at times, it is somewhat a constant in this universe. So while we are bringing together the most qualified and purposeful guides to interact with you at this time, we are bringing them through a great many others that we would consider council members.
I may bring in other groups or individuals as the need arises in this show, but I want to first start where we left off in our last conversation in the last Channel Revelation show. But I want to establish some foundational understanding about some things and some individuals in history, just so we have a good place to stand on as a foundation for topics we'll discuss today and in future shows. So last time, one of the things we discussed, or in many shows, we discussed how there was a cataclysm about 9,000 to 13,000 years ago. This was also written about in Plato's works as well. Referencing the submersion of Atlantis, for example. So we do have some historical information as well as many ancient sites around the world that are buried even to this day or underwater from approximately that time period. You mentioned, though, that this cataclysm that occurred 13,000 years ago is a cataclysm that has occurred even prior to that. So it's a repeating pattern. And today, we are again experiencing another repeat of the same cataclysm, although it's playing out differently. Another thing that we discussed last time was about the Adam and Eve story, which is also present in the Anunnaki storyline. They reference having genetically modified the beings that were on the earth at that time, and they also use the Adam and Eve terminology. And what you were saying was that wasn't the original, that isn't the Adam and Eve the Bible's referring to. It's an even older story, which I don't want to get into the older story, but what I want to understand is this just a law or a universal law in this universe, or maybe all the universes, that cycles or patterns repeat throughout time or whatever, throughout experience until the collective or the beings who experience it in some way resolve that pattern? And that's why we're seeing these storylines continue to repeat throughout history and modern times?
So let's speak to this not necessarily in terms of universal law, but creation. Because if we are to go back to the very beginning of time, even beyond the manifestation of your planet Earth, we might consider that everything has been born of the original creator, which many of you would refer to as God or prime creator. And what many of us have observed from a universal standpoint, based on our research and various metaphysical theories, is that the universe thrives upon expansion. And expansion has little to do necessarily with vibration. It has more to do with the idea that you're taking something that has happened before and you are now perceiving it in such a way that it becomes improved. Ultimately, what expansion is evolution. So in order for an entire race, even a universal family, to continue to evolve together, they are taking what was before, they are perceiving it through a unique form of consciousness, and then somewhat modifying it to their likeness, an act no less important than that of prime creator itself. Now, we reference quite often in these transmissions the spiral of time, and the organization and operation of that is quite complex. We simplify it by saying that the spiral of time will bring events from history back around in order for certain races or interdimensional groups of beings to revisit them, not necessarily to have the same experience again, but to awaken to things that those who created them did not have access to. And ultimately, this is expansion in terms of consciousness. When we're expanding in consciousness, we are shifting the viewpoint, not necessarily having to change the mechanics of a timeline, although that obviously does happen when a collective consciousness expands. What we're hoping to do is through the perception of it, model it into something new. So patterns, it is a good way to look at the criteria for how the spiral works. Patterns or waveform come together in groups or categorized in similar fashions. And humans who are ready, for example, to interface with those patterns will begin to play them out in an experience. And many of you are familiar with astrology and especially how the heavenly bodies align to the various decisions that you've made prior to coming, whether it has been your pre-incarnate choice of a date of birth or the family that you arrived in or the lineage that you would carry. Having access to these patterns is very beneficial, even though many of you would say it is not, because you are not here creating from nothingness. The foundation of all that you are creating from has existed before. But there are so many things that you can choose to create from that would enlighten your experience beyond what it has been. So if consciousness is suppressed and history comes back around, and as individuals and collectives, you are working with patterns, what you might find has happened is you have been limited in your perspective of being able to view them through a completely different lens. Because through that lens, all things are changed.
So would you say that the time that we're in now, when this cataclysm from the Great Flood is repeating, which is this time showing up in many little things around the world that are more targeted as opposed to one global event like the Great Flood, is that in any way representing that we have progressed as a consciousness since the Great Flood, or has anything changed, in whether for the better or worse in that sense?
Well, let's look at the progression, not necessarily since the Great Flood, but in relationship to where you've been over the last 100 years, because we think that that's the most important consideration, even though we will answer your question momentarily. It isn't necessarily that a race evolves in consciousness enough to not have to experience the same events again. What's actually happening is a race begins to prepare itself to evolve. In other words, a chain of events has happened long before a significant cataclysmic repeating timeline approaches. There is some predestiny in this, obviously, but you all have the free will to work within that predestiny however you choose. The individuals in a race like humanity are all magnetizing together similar history that must and will repeat. Yet signals are sent to the universe as to how to manifest that history. And we've used the example before that nothing can truly be hidden from you. So there are many going back in time to discover ancient relics or to try to prove or disprove that something existed. And if there is success in the way of that endeavor, it is often because prior to a discovery being made, the collective consciousness has raised in its vibration and its dimension enough to match what is necessary to understand. So the very idea that a timeline of this magnitude has come back around again tells us that you've certainly evolved and are the people who are able to handle it, not necessarily from an emotional standpoint or from a physical ground level experience, but through the perception of consciousness, through the evolution of spirit. And that is a different concept for everyone who is listening to this transmission, because it is not that you are meant to see everything as truth in the same way as any other, but you're here as a mirror reflection of how the collective is meant to counteract the most malevolent history that it has ever faced. Meaning, within the cosmos of your own life, you are perceiving the landscape and you are somehow creating in your personal experience something that moves well beyond it. So it's a very delicate orchestration, in other words, that you are the people who are calling forth this history and determining how it manifests, while also within the midst of it in a quantum fashion, moderating it to a certain degree. So when we look at a very massive cataclysm, like the Great Flood, for example, what we might say is that when it manifested as a cataclysm, it came with such force and with such precision that even a highly conscious collective that may have been present on the planet at the time could not have foreseen it, nor had the ability to intersect with it in such a way to stop it. And you are different individuals, different humans in a completely different timeline now. You have become more conscious, and consciousness tends to like to magnetize the smallest details of the most thorough manifestation of an event. In other words, it's like a detective attempting to look at the clues of a crime scene, even though those clues all have to be categorized in order to truly understand the timeline and how it unfolded. In the moment, the detective isn't necessarily trying to put a timeline together. What they are doing is they are cherishing every small detail, knowing that it is an important part and will fit together later. And so this is what you are all doing right now. You've come with a new form of consciousness, a higher vibration, the ability to truly see the smallest details within a very massive event, and then be able to put them together in a fashion other than what those on the planet at the time it happened may have concluded. And this is what we think is such a brilliant part of what you call free will, which we know is sometimes limited in its definition. Regardless of what has happened before, regardless of what you're challenged by in the moment, how you step through that experience will give you a window into all of the possibilities at your fingertips to manifest it differently or even to your liking.
Does this general way that the universe works in any way, and this is on the bigger scale, on a planetary scale, let's say, does it also apply on an individual scale? Meaning, let's say that someone had some sort of a trauma or personal cataclysm, let's say, in their current human life, or maybe even a past life of the same soul. Does that pattern continue to repeat for that soul or even within one human life? Let's say a breakup of a relationship that was particularly traumatic. Does that pattern continue to repeat in the same way to allow the individual to rewrite that pattern in some way?
It does, because you are each the microcosm of the macrocosm. So within the universe, there are collective protocols and there are individual protocols based upon how a soul incarnates and what form it chooses. So here on planet Earth, we talk a great deal about a soul's divine plan. And the divine plan is something foreseen long before an incarnation is chosen. It is not planned to the very minute detail of what a soul will experience in its life. It is more a vibrational determination of how much it will grow, expand, and evolve in one lifetime, which is ultimately contributing to the themes of many lifetimes running consecutively within the universe. But to imagine that divine plan is to also consider that there is a field of energy supporting it. So the spiral of time that we talk about frequently when it comes to collective realities, it is also feeding individual ones as well. You think that you are repeating the same traumatic relationship that you experienced in this life or another. But ultimately, the foundation of every one of those experiences is made manifest from the human condition, meaning there is a contribution of creative energy from not only all of your ancestors that you are dealing with individually, but also yourself. So when a soul begins to replay the same timeline over and over, a relationship, for example, what's happening is they're perceiving it through the exact same content or amount of density, level of dimension, and vibration. We have previously considered this equation an imprint. Typically, what happens in human relationship is each relationship is categorized with an idea, an imprint of how the human being sees itself through the experienced. For example, the one who has been traumatized. If that imprint of the one that has been traumatized carries on beyond the end of the relationship that was traumatizing, another relationship is magnetized and drawn, not for the purpose of suffering, not because this soul has done anything wrong, but because what consciousness truly wants is every opportunity at its disposal to heal what the human collective has been dealing with in terms of history for a very long period of time. So while it feels very personal, and we know that it does, from an angelic perspective, you are all choosing aspects, we'll say, of the human condition. Some of the densest and darkest things that have gone on that have yet to be evolved, because you, from a karmic standpoint, are not here to pay debts or to suffer because of what you or others have done before. You are here with the courage, the wherewithal, the confidence, the ingenuity, the creativity to actually change it in action. But a direct connection has to be made especially on the earth plane, to the physicality of it in order to vibrationally change it. And this is what many humans forget. They are attempting to use spiritual practice and process to rid themselves of what was before. And we agree that there are incredible modalities, many of those coming from ancient history and even our own star systems, that move a soul back in the direction of its divine plan, help it to relieve the density, the thoughts, the emotions around the past. But the true practice, the true manifestation point comes when another physical experience arrives in which we can put all of that into action. So while we're speaking a great deal about the workings of the universe, we really want to bring it close to home in terms of the planet that you chose and the physical incarnation that you also chose, which dictates that you must consider you are both energetic as well as physical beings.
Can we also say the same would apply to storylines from ancient times? For example, I've looked through many historical examples of different stories that seem to keep repeating, such as the story of Moses. There are many stories of Moses, some that even seem to predate the biblical story of Moses. So, and I found that to be true for many ancient figures, that the story seems to have been duplicated throughout ancient times. Is that another thing that does reoccur in this experience?
It is the perfect example, we believe, not only in what you have been dealing with on planet Earth, which is a complete and total repeat of timeline energy in the same dimension, but also how the spiral of time actually works, because it isn't that the same events and the same people come back around to play out stories in the same way. Through your consciousness, you are reassembling them as if you are players on a stage. So you intersect with the energy, the influence, the vibration, the imprint even of history that has gone before you. This is a prominent pattern always that has yet to be rearranged. And you are here receiving all of the manifestations of it in your personal lives or in community or in collective spaces, and playing them out such that you orchestrate a very purposeful change. And unfortunately, humans have been lowered so much in their consciousness that they are suffering more through the repeating stories than they are using them as agents of awakening, which they truly are. Any karmic experience that you repeat, anything that is brought forward from the past that you notice replaying in the collective or in your personal life, is the universe providing an opportunity for you to move beyond it. So how you perceive this repeating energy has everything to do with how it must repeat or not again.
So when you say intersect, is that when a soul comes into a physical incarnation, they have decided beforehand that they're going to intersect with certain fragments of experience, perhaps that an entirely different soul might have experienced on Earth in a different timeline or in a different time?
It isn't quite that linear in terms of choosing very specific experiences, even though we know that this explanation seems the easiest to grasp for those of you that are here in an earthly fashion, because we want you to always keep in mind that prior to incarnating, and we referenced the idea of heaven in the previous transmission, you're in such a merged state that many of these decisions are not made alone. In other words, you're not making them in a singular determination. You're making them on behalf of an entire collective. It's as if everyone who incarnated at the exact same time period as you did took a piece of the puzzle with them and determined what those puzzle pieces would be in a joint fashion. And you're here as an individual, not necessarily attempting to take responsibility for some of these onerous aspects of history, but to actually see how your individuality, your uniqueness, and your purpose contribute or fit in to these various themes. And this has also been an issue, we'll say, if we are looking back at many of the ancient timelines up till modern periods like today, is that humans have been trained out of the idea that they have any type of purpose that fulfills the collective or themselves. You have been somewhat slighted away from even the idea that you have something unique to express within you. You are always taught to look outside of you to fit into a specific mold, or to decide to do things that are not necessarily for you, but for your ability to thrive or to earn money. If we took all of that away, all of those limiting beliefs away, what we would see is an entire collective of angels who, from the highest perspective, saw how these repeating patterns were all somewhat the same and chose to take them on in an individual fashion at the physical level to intersect with the energy and to work it as if they were molding the clay on a potter's wheel. And you all have this ability to mold the energy of physical experience as you are in the midst of it, such that future generations never have to experience it the same way again.
I'd like to speak with Mary Magdalene for the next few questions. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is this channel intersecting with past incarnations that you've experienced, or in some way expressing a fragment of your life journey?
This is true, yet we want to explain it in a different fashion such that it can be well understood, for there are many who feel a relationship to my life and many of the experiences that they are having that may mirror some of the challenges that I have faced. An ascended master does not reincarnate itself through any one individual soul. Yet the importance of the timeline that the souls are in today will dictate how many volunteers will take hold of a fragment of my soul or another master's and integrate it into their own life. There are some in which that fragment or that piece of myself that they carry is not a dominant expression in relationship to a great many others, because an ascended master does not arrive alone. Any ascended master who has walked the earth has chosen to embody the essence of many others through itself. This is why it is called a master to begin with. But there are some, not unlike this channel, who may be choosing or have been selected, in other words, to manifest a more potent essence of that master and experience their life as if they were that master's past incarnation. And this is only because of the history that you speak of, meaning there is some direct correlation to the life that was lived before and the one that the soul is perceiving in the quantum now.
In the context of what we were just discussing about how these patterns repeat, either on the global scale or in our individual lives, how does that apply to someone like this channel who is living out a manifestation or an expression of a life journey that you had?
It is difficult to contemplate how this would manifest across the board in every individual, because you are all unique manifestations of consciousness choosing different physical journeys for a specific purpose. But from the standpoint of ancient history, what a soul is striving for is to not see itself as the ascended master whose fragments of soul it has chosen. But to allow those fragments to express in modern day life such that everything that they attempt to create is touched by the wisdom or the magic of the beings that have gone before them. Because ultimately, this is all who you are. You believe yourself to be here as someone other than you were before, and even separate of the ascended masters that you cherish, when in fact, you are all connected. We are all connected in a universal matrix of energy that blends our experiences as one. So what this channel may be experiencing, for example, is a unique reflection of the lifetime that I've walked, the stories that are left behind of me, and the gifts and abilities that I possessed, attuned to the timeline that she is in, that is so important and was chosen. So it is as if through the evolution of this soul's life, more and more of a relationship begins to build with not only myself, but other aspects beyond the veil, universally, cosmically, that are here and present in order to serve, because you are not here doing this alone. In fact, this is one of the most valuable assets of your human DNA, is that within it, a library of parallel experiences is categorized or are categorized. And these are meant to raise up alchemically and purposely in the moment that they are needed. So problems that you face today, even though they may ring very true to what you've experienced before, have all somewhat already been solved. And you're here considering the possibility that all of those answers are already within you. And this is the greatest teaching, we believe, of an ascended master, or the mastery that each soul is able to achieve, that you are yearning and also learning from a deep part of you within that we consider to be relatable to God or prime creator, and cannot be distinguished individually beyond itself. Every soul has within it the capacity to achieve this level of mastery. It has just been hidden from you throughout history.
Were you also a channel in that lifetime with Yeshua?
I was very respected as an oracle at this time, relied upon not only by the Yeshua you speak of, but also many others in my lineage, and within what I will say is a circle of those who were supportive and expanding the teachings of Christ to the world. This was trained within me from a very early age. It was a gift that I was born with and was nurtured by my mother prior to her passing. Yet something that I could not do in an exposed sense. Those who were tapping into the wisdom of my channeling were doing so very much in secret. For if it was known that I had this ability, especially in many of the societal constraints of the time, I would have been perhaps, or would have met my demise.
Now, in your time, you studied with a lot of mystery schools. Am I correct in that assumption?
This is correct.
And now the Bible, which obviously has been changed and modified for probably political reasons throughout generations, but the Bible specifically is against sorcery and things of that nature. Is would channeling be considered that, or is sorcery more referring to black magic or something like that?
It is an interesting definition that you're choosing to explore, because while many who would have lent their information and history to biblical accounts were actually practicing these oracular powers and ways of divine communication. There were some who interpreted their words to mean that this went against God. So much of what is being interpreted in the Bible today is somewhat a limitation, or even a skewing from the truth of history, where even the disciples, for example, were channeling information from higher sources. They, as men, however, were respected in the information that was coming through more in a societally accepted way than the women.
Okay, those are the only questions I have specifically for Mary. I'd like to move on with the earlier direction. So going back to the Great Flood in 9 to 13,000 years ago time period, at that time, or prior to that time, we've previously discussed many times about how Atlantis existed on the Earth in the ninth dimension, and the Anunnaki group with Enlil and Enki were in the fifth dimension. When that cataclysm occurred and the civilization of Atlantis was eliminated, although some of those people obviously made the transition to this dimension that we're in now, did the ninth dimension cease to exist on the Earth after that time?
The ninth dimension has always existed on the earth and continues to. So it is a misnomer that any physical cataclysm would wipe out a dimensional container, because Earth is a multi-dimensional planet. For example, we have gone into depth about the inner Earth and how within the inner Earth there are many different dimensional realities that you would not necessarily be able to perceive, but nonetheless exist. So physical manifestations are very different in their presentation and unfolding than how dimensions are created and continue to live on. Think of dimension as an organization of information and history. So even though Atlantis was a ninth dimensional physical community that met its demise, everything that was created in Atlantis and even the Atlantean civilization has continued to create based on all that it was before. And that dimension lives on.
So the ninth dimension lives on, and there are other civilizations or beings that are existing there having a different experience, although Atlantis came to an end.
Correct, yes.
So that would be similar to if today we had some global cataclysm, but the Earth continued on and some people survived and continued forward.
Yes, and it is always a determination of the individuals who have gone through the cataclysm as to whether or not they will continue to create in the dimension that they were before, because we have to make a distinction here between those that have passed on, meaning they chose to end their incarnation on Earth and reincarnate elsewhere, and those who were privy to the advancement of this cataclysm and began to migrate, because some did, as we've mentioned. There were very advanced and enlightened Syrian elders that were present in Atlantis prior to and even up until the fall. And the technologies that were created on the physical Atlantis, while we speak to them all of the time, were not exclusive in terms of their ability to work with ships and various plasma technologies that would transpose a physical soul between dimensions. And these are examples, we'll say, of how some of those beings continued to create in a dimension that you are not accessing, but nonetheless still exists.
I'd like to speak with Thoth.
Okay.
All right, just to review from our conversation previously, you were incarnated on Atlantis in the ninth dimension and then were able to make the transition to, after the cataclysm, to the dimension that followed, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So is the dimension that followed the third dimension, or was it something else at that time?
This period on planet Earth was very similar to the one that you are in now, but not necessarily expressing in the same dimensional ranges, meaning to have had a cataclysm happen in the ninth dimension would indicate that there was a very significant split of timelines happening on the same planet, meaning that physical beings were choosing two distinctly different realities to co create within. And because of that, what we have to rectify is that between the fifth and the ninth dimension, there are many different opportunities to manifest, meaning fifth dimensional energies, as we have mentioned, are a lead in or a portal to operating within all 12 dimensions. Not necessarily moving beyond physicality, but having the ability to retrieve what is necessary universally, cosmically, to create physical things on a physical planet. The ninth dimension works a bit differently. And with the disintegration of Atlantis, we saw a great many beings migrating into different dimensions. And their influence there, was the important area of focus. And let's relate it again to what you're experiencing today on planet Earth, as many speak to a third to fifth dimensional timeline split. Between those two realities is a very mysterious place where human beings are unknowingly contributing to one or another. And even in the fifth dimension, those that are entirely focused there may even be peripheralating or creating beyond it, bringing in the potential of a sixth or a seventh dimensional reality. So at this juncture, what we noticed was those that lived in Atlantis and chose a more physical incarnation, carrying out its creative efforts on Earth, began to operate more in the fifth dimension. And the reason for this is that many of the technologies that were upholding the frequencies that would allow the ninth dimension to thrive had become dismantled. So in the fifth dimension, what we notice, and you may notice this as well, is you are becoming more collectively focused, yet still manifesting in very unique individual ways. You have your own homes, your own lives. You're focused on your own longevity and prosperity. And many of us began to do the same, simply out of the dire need to create new lives and to live in new ways on a planet that was very unstable. Naturally, there were many influences that were taking place at this time that we could say lowered that frequency even more. So, yes, third dimensional timelines eventually did become more the norm and continue to be today, while some of us were choosing to exist in a higher dimension.
And you were choosing to exist in what dimension?
The fifth dimension was a more common place for my vibration to exist, yet keep in mind also that the ninth dimensional capabilities that I brought to the planet as a hybrid soul were always accessible to me.
What was it like for you to go from a ninth dimensional experience on the planet to a fifth dimensional one? Did it alter your perspectives or behaviors or emotional states or anything like that?
As you can imagine, migrating from one dimensional reality to another, it is very saddening and full of hardship because what you knew before no longer exists. And while many of us were energetic masters, we were in such a state of transition that accessing that energetic mastery was not always an easy thing. So, this was not an easy time on planet Earth. Nonetheless, the exciting period of renewal and rebuilding is what I most want to focus on. And ultimately, every collective will go through periods of ebb and flow where systems break down and communities fall apart and new ones are born simply because it is important for those humans to perpetuate what they have learned in a new civilization with new relationships. And that was ultimately one of the most exciting parts of that period was as representatives of an Atlantean society, we were bringing concepts that had never been heard before, teachings that many were not privy to collectives who were ready and willing to hear them. And this is why more enlightened civilizations on the planet began after the fall of Atlantis.
And this you just mentioned how you brought these ninth dimensional concepts to an existing civilization. Now, this existing civilization, was that the Anunnaki fifth dimensional timeline that continued forward from Enlil and Enki in ancient times?
There was an intersecting with that timeline, yes. And it is important to note, as mentioned previous to this transmission, that not all of the Anunnaki who were on the planet at the time were malevolently focused or attempting to obstruct genetics. Some of them came very similarly to myself with ninth dimensional knowledge and wisdom and access to share some of their advanced technologies with earthly civilizations, to help them understand certain forms of architecture as well as sound healing, how to time travel even. So when you pose this question, what I want to make clear is that you are seeing a dichotomy here of dark and light, of intersection with various Anunnaki being seen as gods who were working from a more benevolent or heart-based frequency, and others who were not.
So the Anunnaki timeline that started with Enlil and Enki, it continued forward to modern times then. So that timeline was not interrupted, if I'm understanding correctly, whereas the ninth dimension with Atlanteans is what was interrupted, and so some of the Atlanteans, such as yourself, were able to make the transition into the fifth dimensional existing Anunnaki timeline. Am I correct in that understanding?
That is a correct assumption. Yes, it's a very complex orchestration or creative manifestation to actually explain. Yet it does happen where we have seen on other planets, and in different dimensions, that timelines become hijacked, focused in on, disintegrated, somehow brought down, while others are focused upon and continue to thrive. It is not the way of the universe in terms of law that this is the case, yet there are many advanced beings who understand the dynamics of how to do this, both from a technological standpoint as well as working with energy.
So the Anunnaki timeline that was at the time of the cataclysm that affected Atlantis, they experienced it on the fifth dimension as the Great Flood. But that Great Flood also occurred on the ninth dimension with Atlantis. Am I correct? There was a convergence of that same experience?
Always on the same physical planet will timelines intersect at some point, because all that incarnate within one planet or on one star system have bound between them contractually the need to experience similar events, because regardless of the dimension you exist in and whether or not you interact with each other, all dimensions are going to be affected by a catastrophic event of this nature. And let's take this concept just a bit further to give you a simplistic example that we think will help to integrate it. Nature, for example, is a spectrum of interdimensional energy. Many of you are familiar with crystals as conscious living beings, as rocks, the fairies, for example, the network of trees and their roots beneath the earth. They are all existing in a higher dimension than actually human beings are today. But if a cataclysm were to happen, nature would be just as physically and vibrationally affected as every other human, and vice versa. So yes, both timelines were certainly affected by this cataclysm. Yet, keep in mind that the cataclysm itself was created or seeded by a group of malevolent beings. So those with knowledge of impending events like this are either shielding themselves from the catastrophe or have somehow put into motion a manifestation potential to move beyond it, whether that's a technological type of manifestation or whether it's actually coming from the mapping out of ley lines and grids and following them to safer locations. Certainly, this was the case.
And so you're referring to the Anunnaki storyline where the some people survived that flood. For example, Noah was instructed in what to do to survive with his family. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct, yes.
Is it always necessary for a cataclysm such as that to occur in order for a dimensional or two dimensions to intersect, such as right now we're going from a third to a fifth dimension? Is that always coincided with a cataclysmic event?
Not necessarily. So the timeline collision has little to do with a cataclysm. Yet often what we see is a cataclysm is a potential, and this is why. When you are in the midst of any timeline collision or intersection of two different dimensions, what's happening is an attempt to rectify the split at hand, meaning every planet, every race, every star system, those that incarnate there are meant to evolve together. So even though different dimensions exist and Earth is a multidimensional being, those of you who are focused into this reality, even if it's a third dimensional one, are meant to incrementally evolve and move it forward. And in order to do that, a new dimension must be tapped into. And this is why many of you who are spiritually awakening or using different ancient modalities to access your Kundalini or your life force are having such profound cosmic experiences, interaction with beings that you've never met that exist beyond the veil, because you are intersecting with a different dimension and a different timeline. And in so doing, have the opportunity to bring that experience into your own to enhance it. So what we are leaning towards here is the idea that anytime two timelines that have been running perpendicular to each other and never intersected finally do, it is only because something is attempting to rectify itself, where there is a purposeful exchange of energy, information, even teachings that can be shared that will affect the whole of the collective, the whole of the planet. Now, the reason that cataclysms often arrive during these periods is that for a cataclysm to truly occur, there has to be such intensity in the timeline dimensional collision that we speak of, that it brings back some of these periods again. It isn't necessary, however, that the cataclysm has to manifest as it did before. Remember, consciousness is determining the speed, the intensity, the level, the different formats that past cataclysmic events can take. And this is why, at this period in modern days, you may be noticing many separate individual events occurring that ring true to that time period, but aren't to the magnitude of it, because you have, as a human collective, now achieved a higher bandwidth of energy and vibration through which you are awakening to the cataclysm itself. So perhaps we could say, in past experiences, those that were in the midst of the cataclysm weren't necessarily privy to the awakening that was possible through it. But now, more so than not, humans have become aware of the cataclysm prior to it manifesting in its fullness. And because of that, they are perceiving it completely differently and have new and better outcomes that they are manifesting in the astral.
You said that when this great flood occurred, the dominant dimension, at least you can correct me if I'm on the wrong track, what that everybody entered into was a fifth dimensional Anunnaki timeline that had been going on for some time, and that eventually everybody or majority of people moved into the third dimension. Am I correct so far?
You're correct, yet let's make the distinction here, because we want to keep in mind that even though we might say this Anunnaki timeline was reminiscent of the fifth dimension at the very beginning, those that arrived here that were focusing the humans on the planet in a lower dimension may not have realized that through the work of their own hands and through the plans of their own minds, they were lowering the dimension that they would exist in as well.
Okay, so the Anunnaki timeline that exists since the time of Enlil was in the fifth dimension. The Great Flood occurred. The Atlanteans, who were in the ninth dimension, also entered the fifth dimension, which was the same as the Anunnaki timeline. And then as a result, even the Anunnaki beings were lowered to a third dimension along with everybody who came from the ninth. Am I understanding correctly?
That is correct.
Okay. Did some beings continue on in the fifth dimension, or did everybody move into the third dimension?
It is depending upon the relationship of that being beyond the Earth experience. In other words, many of you have reached beyond the third dimension yourself, yet you're still existing within it in a material fashion. So yes, the simple answer is yes. Certainly, some of those beings retained their ability to access and work within the fifth dimension, even though a more dominant third dimensional reality began to manifest around them.
So beings such as you, Thoth, were walking in a fifth dimension, but since a fifth, and as we discussed in previous conversations, since a fifth and the third dimension are close enough together, you still would perceive other third dimensional beings as physical, but as we've talked about before, maybe those third dimensional beings wouldn't necessarily be interested in you or the things that you were speaking or teaching about. Is that correct so far?
It is correct, yet not in every instance. Remember, those who were more enlightened masters of energy or teachers, they came to sometimes purposely interact with those who had been lowered in their consciousness and vibration to share what they had learned and to propose the opportunity to awaken them to new ideas. So, in general, yes, souls are meant to magnetize the beings around them that are of both a vibrational and dimensional match. Yet, This does not consider the idea of soul contracts, which are a much more complex topic, yet we can simplify by saying everyone's purpose, regardless of the timeline they've incarnated on or the dimension that they are in, is to uplift and assist others. So from time to time, it is inevitable that you will interact with those who are not on the same vibrational wavelength as you, because somehow you are the glue between the possibility of them raising to a higher dimension and how they are able to get there.
So is this similar to what's happening today, where there's the third and fifth dimension also coexisting, and some beings may show up that are accessing fifth and third dimension as teachers to some who may be in the third dimension who come as students because of that soul contract you're referring to?
We agree, yes.
And so this is similar to what you as Thoth were experiencing in the ancient times after the flood. In Egypt, let's say, as an example, and is this the source of a lot of the Egyptian mystery schools and such? There were fifth dimensional beings, perhaps some from Atlantis, who were existing in this fifth dimension primarily, or in addition to the third, interacting with students who were of the third dimension.
Yes, that is true. And you might consider those who were fifth dimensional as conduits for accessing the light teachers beyond that dimension, whether it was through channeled contact or downloads, bringing in the wisdom of those teachings in a more applicable and physical way.
Was when we move to now in archaeological research and such, they have determined, at least based on their scientific analysis, that the first writing occurred in ancient Sumer and that time period, which was roughly 8 to 10,000 or 6 to 10,000 years ago. That time period, and there may be other writings we haven't discovered in that time window, but there has been no, that I'm aware of anyway, written documents or anything of that nature that pre-existed that time period. Is that because now the Anunnaki, of course, timeline existed in the fifth dimension for much longer, but we're not finding any writings, let's say, of Atlantis. Is that because Atlanteans didn't really write things down in the ninth dimension? You don't do that necessarily, whereas third dimension we speak and communicate and write language.
Well, what you must consider in Atlantis is several things. First, in a higher vibration, the beings that are there are operating more in telepathy than they are in the slower speed of vibration required to communicate through writing. It does not necessarily mean that records were not kept, yet records were kept in a completely different way. So imagine today your computers and your software programs and your various devices in which you store things that you wish to save, whether they are writings or media or captures of your life or teachings that you would like to share. In Atlantis, crystalline technologies were used as massive storage devices to save some of the most precious teachings and history that we would want to share with future generations. It was more a vibrational transference as well as done through contact with these various crystals and technologies. Yet, because of the cataclysm that happened and the breakdown of these many technologies, some of that history has been lost and would not be accessible today, for you would not have the ability to know how to access what it was we shared. Yet, know, of course, that the time is coming in which you will be able to access those things again. Also, it's important to remember that In a ninth dimensional reality, especially one like Atlantis with such advanced high vibrational technologies, everyone existed in a quantum reality, which may translate to humans today as a present moment type of experience where what happened before or what may be in the future was rarely a consideration. So when civilizations are capturing history and writing it, for example, in paragraphs and novels, it does require somewhat getting out of the present moment and considering how someone else may perceive and utilize the piece that you are offering. Or you have to reflect backwards as to what happened in your civilization and share it with others in a very deliberate way. In our determination, however, this is almost always distorted in some way. So this is a difficult teaching to share, but we think it is worth the conversation. Anytime someone is writing their perspective of a teaching or history or a story, their consciousness and vibration is forever expressed in that translation. And this is why we believe there is so much limitation today on the translation of ancient history, whether it be biblical times, the period of Egypt, and many others, because those who are attempting to translate are translating it through a completely different consciousness and vibration, and apt to lend their own perspective, which completely changes the story. And so in Atlantis, it was more of a pure translation. In a crystallized fashion, someone was receiving a teaching or ancient history without any distortion that was left behind of another, so that they could make their own determination of how it was yet to be put into their personal lives, which isn't necessarily available today other than some of the purest channeled transmissions that are written or shared in words, meaning those that have absolutely no inflection of the one who is channeling their ego or their perception. These transmissions are able to be taken by each individual, very much like a crystalline technology, and integrated personally into their lives. They become even quantum, such that they will change as the individual changes their perception, their dimension, and their vibration.
So this ancient Atlantean knowledge still exists in crystals on the planet. It's just that we've not yet reached the ninth dimensional ability to access that knowledge. Is that correct?
There are some who are even in possession of these great many crystals that we speak of, whether they exist in the fullness of their form or have been broken apart. But yes, certainly you haven't reached the point in your evolution where you would consider that you are able to use these crystals to retrieve the history and the knowledge.
All right, so now here we find ourselves in this third to fifth dimensional space and another cataclysm as well. And we are reconnecting with this fifth dimension, which existed right after the flood. What's been going on in that fifth dimension since we sort of deviated from it after the Great Flood and entered the third dimension, and now we're again reconnecting with the fifth dimension? Has anything been developing there, or what exactly are we reconnecting to?
Well, the fifth dimension is very malleable. It is very pliable. As we have mentioned, there are beings there who believe in the mystery of connecting beyond the earth and into the universe. And the Akashic records are massive. So what you may see is the evolution of various teachings, even religions or prayers, various different metaphysical groups that are breaking off and following certain traditions, yet also seeing some influence here from beings that are not in the highest and best intention for those in the fifth dimension. So what we're looking at from a fifth dimensional standpoint is still an access to Atlantean types of principles like instantaneous manifestation, the ability to work with alternate technologies, channeling in information from beyond the veil, various forms of healing technologies, even sound. This was a very important aspect of that timeline. Yet, very much like what you've experienced today in the third dimension, there came a point where these things became, we'll say, slighted or hidden or attempted to be corrupted by those in power.
What was the reason for the origination of the idea of a mystery school in the first place, where fifth dimensional beings such as yourselves in that timeline after the flood were teaching those perhaps of a fifth to a third dimension at that time? Why were these teachings ever turned into sort of an isolated thing where only the adepts were allowed to learn it, and to this day?
Well, let's first rectify the idea of what you call adepts, because the mystery schools, while it seems they were very exclusive and not open to everyone, took a great deal of diversity in terms of their format. Myself and many others were involved in helping those on the planet at the time to let go of the density and the destruction that they were being focused into. Because even though some had survived a cataclysm, you can imagine the devastation and the focus on physical and the outlook at the time. And what we were striving for was to bring back some of the Atlantean prophecies and teachings, yet to actually succeed at that required humans to become more collectively focused or unified, or accessing the purity of their heart at a time when they may have been otherwise distracted. Keep in mind, to uphold a ninth dimensional reality, everyone is considering beyond themselves. No one is taking a position in a hierarchy above any other. In the mystery schools, it may seem that those of us who were teachers were taking that role of authority, yet what our goal was to establish that everyone had the ability to energetically access a part of their own divine template that could serve the earth and the entire collective in a very profound way. In Atlantis, there were pyramids. And these pyramids were manifested through the conjoined efforts of all of us focused on a similar outcome. It was not only in an astral sense that we were manifesting physical things, but we were shown from various technological graphs and mappings of the inner earth and other architectural designs from cosmic locations, how to put it together in the most concise way. And certainly we were able to call in and work with our cosmic families who were using very ornate templates to alchemize elements into precision technologies that we could enter and actually utilize to our healing benefit. Yet these individuals that we were meeting in the fifth dimension, for example, had no ability to come together in unison in this way. And we have focused on the prophecy of knowing thyself simply because knowing thyself is the way to unity consciousness. For if each individual understands their relationship to the one or prime creator, they're able to harness that energy in benefit of everyone else. And this was ultimately our goal, was to teach others what we had learned long ago about harnessing the energy of Prime Creator that ultimately existed within us, and to use it in a focused, collective sense to benefit not only the entire Earth, but all of those who were living upon it.
Now, you are also partly of an Anunnaki genetics, correct?
That is correct.
Are there any, would you be able to speak to events that occurred in the timeline of Enlil and Enki, or is there another Anunnaki being who may be more qualified to speak to those events that may be of a higher consciousness?
We can speak to those events, yes.
Okay. So in a previous conversation, I believe the last time we talked, we were discussing how the Enlil and Enki, in particular, Enki was responsible for the mining of gold on Earth, and in doing so, he eventually genetically modified the people who were living in the forest at the time, and the Anunnaki considered these people to be of a primitive nature in their description, and modified them to be workers. Now, so I'd like to talk a bit about that. We discussed last time how the Anunnaki and these quote unquote primitive people who were living in the forest were both in the fifth dimension, but the people in the forest were, we might say, a bit more enlightened because they had less density. So, in a manner of speaking, their consciousness was higher than that of the Anunnaki at that time. But what would prompt a fifth dimensional, less density being to want to be genetically modified by the Anunnaki whose consciousness is less? Is that similar to how today we may have fifth dimensional people or beings walking the earth who may choose to follow the, let's say, third dimensional things that are going on in the world, such as vaccines and things like that? Is that kind of like the same thing?
Well, what you must first consider in speaking of these primitive beings is that their desire was to live a more material experience in the fifth dimension, not in the sense that many of you are today, focused on monetary abundance, for example, or vanity, or certain relationships. These beings were very closely connected to nature, meaning they were in a very symbiotic relationship to the plants and the elements, and living somewhat of an ancient native type of life, where not only were they nomads, but they were using all of the elements at their disposal to live a very prosperous and fulfilling life, while also giving back to the earth in a reciprocal way. With the introduction of the Anunnaki, who were very savvy in terms of technological advancement, while also very having very in-depth knowledge of elements, what you're seeing in this timeline is the manipulation of nature and the earth itself, not necessarily a direct influence of the genetics like you are today. So we want to give some relevant examples to modern times so you understand what we are speaking of. There are many human beings today on planet Earth who may have no idea that their food supply, or nature, in other words, is being genetically modified. And in that genetic modification, they are taking in a substance that is in turn genetically modifying their own DNA and lowering consciousness and vibration, causing a great deal of destruction, not only in the physical body, but even in the etheric technology that they possess. This is very similar to the accounts of what happened in that timeline, where foraging in nature and utilizing these various resources became interrupted by the implanting of the Anunnaki of foreign substances that changed nature itself. And it has less to do, even we believe, with the ingestion of food and more to do with actually changing the environment. You are experiencing this in modern times as well, where various foreign chemicals are being introduced into certain environments through the air. Very similarly, the Anunnaki introduced unknown substances, chemically and otherwise, to the natural elements that caused disruptions in the divine genome of the beings who were there. This did take some time. So many of you perceive this story as being an automatic change or something that happened in a very quick fashion. And we see it as a gradual progression where the Anunnaki were actually looked up to as gods. They were perceived as coming from a planet with a very well-known and strong genetic template. So it would be hard to distinguish for humans whether or not these Anunnaki gods had their best interest in mind or not. Even in the timeline where these beings were genetically modified, there were some false introductions of higher vibrational technologies and things to support what these beings were doing in their community from a healing perspective. So trickery was used, in other words, to gain trust and to see these beings as being in the best interest of the whole when in fact they were not.
So let me just sort of rehash what you just said in my own terms, see if I'm understanding correctly. In modern times, there's a terminology that's used called cargo cult, and it's used to refer to indigenous tribes of people who have been living their lives uninterrupted for long periods of time, and then all of a sudden Western cultures start to interface with them and bring their technologies such as boats and airplanes and things, or even Pepsi bottles or Coca-Cola bottles, for example. And these indigenous tribes look up to what we would consider everyday people and what we consider just everyday technology, but to them, we appear as gods, and they treat these individuals as gods. And as a result, they look up to and modify their behaviors, even though it's very possible that these indigenous tribes of people possess a higher consciousness. Is that sort of what took place?
We agree that that would be an accurate description of what took place in this timeline.
Okay, and meanwhile, in modern times, there's spraying chemicals and the food in the skies and everything, and this is also affecting people all over the world, even some who may be living in indigenous parts of the world. So you're saying essentially we're experiencing a similar modification of genetics as the Anunnaki timeline, where this, what they describe as a primitive group of people, were also modified into workers.
This is true, yes.
Okay, so I want to explore that idea a little bit more in depth. You mentioned that, so would it be fair to say that this group of forest dwellers were very similar to the Native Americans of, say, 100 years ago in the United States?
Similar in some ways, yes.
But a higher consciousness, perhaps, or were they similar consciousness?
Well, we see many of the native tribes of the period you speak of having a higher consciousness, mostly because they have excluded themselves to the things that would lower it. So, not necessarily any higher than any other, but certainly operating in close connection to the earth and accessing the wisdom of the four directions and the elements and the various symbiotic relationship of humans to the earth.
So you're saying the Native Americans of 100 years ago were of a higher consciousness than these forest people in the Anunnaki timeline?
No, not necessarily.
Okay. But a similar story would have occurred, if I'm understanding correctly. For example, 100 years ago, the Native Americans still had their traditions and their spiritual practices intact, where today a lot of them run casinos. So that's sort of the same kind of interference that might have occurred as in ancient times?
Every collective, even as they separate on a planet like Earth, is meant to evolve. The question is that evolution being somewhat infiltrated by another? Left to your own, each of you will evolve in the highest and best direction of your soul's evolutionary path and that of the entire collective. But perhaps what we're indicating here is that anytime there is influence in that evolutionary process, things tend to go awry.
Now, in the ancient writings, it suggests that the Anunnaki considered these forest people as primitive. But what is that? What does that mean when they consider these forest people as primitive? What does primitive mean to them?
Well, we think this is a technological determination above all else because remember, many of the Anunnakis who came to Earth were focused on research and technology and science in their home star system and had brought many of these things to the planet. And in comparison, a collective that was working exclusively with nature as their technology may have been looked down upon for not being as advanced as they were.
I see. But in terms of so they modified the genetics through environmental factors and such as we discussed, and did that. So prior to that, these individuals were living in tune with nature, I assume, and living a more harmonious, happy life. Am I on the right track?
Yes, a very simple and happy life.
Okay. And in that life, did they work or have jobs as we consider, for example, certain specific responsibilities to each person? Or did they live in more of a communal fashion where everybody just knew what to do and did what needed to be done?
This tribe operated in more of a communal fashion as you speak, very natural in terms of each individual contributing where their purpose and most important gifts were applicable. And often this would change as younger members of the tribe would begin to mature and come into adulthood. Some would leave behind certain roles to carry out their healing abilities, while others were very happy to focus upon replenishing what had been taken from the earth. There were even native ceremonies that were held, and some responsible for contributing to those. So, yes, we see it somewhat like an early manifestation of an ancient native collective, very connected to the earth and all contributing to the whole.
Now, in the story of Krishna, there is also a similar sort of storyline where Krishna was supposedly interacting with forest people, which in some interpretations people interpreted to be monkey-like beings who lived in the forest, but in literal translation of the text, they were referred to as forest people. So it seems like a very similar story of these forest people who were genetically modified in some way to become workers for these apparently more advanced beings who walk the earth at that time. Is that the same storyline, or is this just another repeat of the same timeline but in a different time and dimension?
We see it more as a pattern that is playing out again with different characters and different timelines with similar circumstances.
So, as we discussed in the earlier conversation, this is a repeat of timeline experiences. So, Krishna wasn't, for example, Enki, but a different manifestation of the same timeline repeating in the hopes of elevating the experience.
We could agree with that, yes.
Okay. And so, getting back to this Anunnaki forest people timeline. Did the Anunnaki, so the various things that they were doing to modify the genetics within the forest and so on to cause these people's genetics to change, were they doing that in a technological calculated way, meaning they knew what outcome they were trying to achieve to cause these individuals who were living in this very symbiotic forest life to want to leave that and become workers for the Anunnaki to fulfill their very scientific or technological path?
Not at the beginning. Keep in mind that much of what the Anunnaki were doing was considered genetic research, meaning oftentimes they were attempting to enhance the genetics of another race. To both become more similar to their own lineage, as well as to be able to tap into the wellspring of information and knowledge that would be available to them. But along the way, in any research project of this caliber that has not been successfully accomplished, things are going to begin to play out that those conducting the research do not expect. The malevolent intent is still there. So we want to ensure that we are not indicating whatsoever that those Anunnaki who were present at the time were in the highest integrity or attempting to create something that would benefit the earth. Yet, in the lowering of the tribe's frequency and their inability to maintain any semblance of their one connection, there was an opportunity for these gods to take advantage. And remember, they were seen as such, more enlightened and able to share technologies that would advance this civilization forward. Many even volunteered to give up their genetics for the research deliberately that may have come as a second phase beyond implicating nature and the earth. So these research projects, we'll call them, went on to new phases beyond just the initial.
Now, in our previous conversation, we ended with a brief touch on the word Lord. And now, Lord in ancient times actually was a term referencing Enlil and also means owner. Now, is that true, first of all? Was that connection originating with Enlil?
Well, every word similar to Lord is apt to be utilized and then influenced in such a way that it contains the imprint of those who use it. So while the word itself, in terms of its origins, isn't something that we necessarily believe is negatively focused, those who adopted it in that way changed it over time. And this is very similar to certain ancient symbology, for example, and words and phrases that have been adopted by malevolent forces and even gods that have changed their meaning.
These forest people whose genetics were manipulated, was something inserted into their genetics that would cause them to change from the symbiotic forest dwelling life that was very fulfilling for them to wanting to be workers for someone else's cause in a non-symbiotic type of environment, such as being workers for the Anunnaki at that time?
Well, you have to consider the series of events that led up to the conclusion that you are suggesting. Because to start with the focus on nature, very much like what you're experiencing today, Eventually, there is going to be the degradation of that nature because something was introduced that was not natural or organic to that environment. Very much like the spreading of chemicals on your earth today. It is not just the crop that receives that chemical that becomes damaged or even genetically modified, but the waters, the soils, the surrounding environment, and anyone stepping into that environment is going to be affected or somehow altered. But what eventually began to happen was not only the shifting of the genetics of those people, but the realization that the land itself was beginning to change. And there was mass confusion because they were not privy to the science, the research, and the technology that these gods were speaking to. As a collective, they did not have the understanding as to how to reverse the changes that they had been led or manipulated even to put into place, and were looking for solutions. So, very much like what happens on planet Earth today, where mass confusion is actually seeded by a group of hierarchical beings, and those that are affected by it become more needy in a sense because they must look outside of themselves for support and for resources, which we ultimately think is the reason why these events are planned to begin with. That is what has happened here, meaning the Anunnaki began to be relied upon and looked at more and more as the saviors of the situation that they had created, that those in the collective had actually fallen victim to.
Okay, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is on a genetic level, was there some sort of manipulation that took place in that period of time that caused, that might even be relevant today? That, for example, let's say that I am a fifth dimensional being and I see the interconnectedness of all things. I don't perceive the world as flat, as we discussed in previous conversations. So I'm not perceiving just a purely third dimensional reality. But let's suppose that my genetics are manipulated through chemtrails and genetically modified foods and vaccines and all of these things. Would it be possible to manipulate my genetics in such a way that I lose sight of that multidimensional interconnectedness perspective of the fifth dimension, and instead I start perceiving more basic things such as getting a job and making money and becoming rich and sex, or like physical sex, for example, those physical third dimensional things? Is it possible to alter genetics in that way?
It is, and it's a complex determination in terms of how this is done, but we want to explain the basics. So imagine your human DNA somewhat like a radio signal or technology, where the number of DNA strands that you are tuning into is actually siphoning from the galactic grids options, various historic events, lifetimes that you've lived before, where you are able to access wisdom and information. This is ultimately the more metaphysical way that your DNA becomes programmed, because human souls aren't necessarily able to work with the entirety of a 12th dimensional DNA signal. At the moment, it would be too much to integrate, and you would not have use for all of it on a material planet. So to some degree, even though you're restoring your DNA template to the fullness of its crystalline and carbon integration, if you were to do that overnight, it would be so demanding and taxing on your physical bodies and structures that you may not have the ability to utilize what you've actually achieved. Well, the same goes in reverse. So anytime you dormantly shut off certain DNA strands or their programming, and focus a signal on one strand or another, you're going to diminish the access to the universal grid, to what some may comprehend as even source energy, where your own creative ability lies. So, yes, it is possible both from a frequency standpoint as well as from a physical standpoint to diminish the access of the DNA to a specific dimension. In fact, if you consider the idea of epigenetics, which is the environment that you create in the body through which the DNA is able to function, this is the perfect analogy that we can use, because some are creating an environment that is full of toxins and negative frequencies, even negative beliefs and thoughts, emotions that are stuck. All of these things are creating a field. And if the DNA is creating a signal and it has to go through a field in order to resonate beyond, the thicker that field is, the more congested it is, the more contaminated or confusing it is, the less able the DNA is apt to function in its proper form.
Is this what happened with the forest people?
Yes, absolutely.
And so when that such a modification occurs to more enlightened beings, such as the forest people were prior to this, it causes them to, as you said, or let me rephrase, sort of not be as connected to source as they were before, and because of that, would it be fair to say that they then would become more reliant on these beings who appear as gods because they cannot source for themselves anymore?
Well, we want to fine tune this idea. You are never disconnected from the source field. It is your perception that becomes lowered to the idea that a source field actually exists. And then what begins to happen is your consciousness cannot perceive the opportunities, the materials, the resources, the abundance of wisdom that source energy is actually providing. And because of that, a soul begins to rely upon another as their source. And that is ultimately what has happened, spanning many timelines throughout ancient history, is that it is not the source field that has been cut off, but the perception of how the source field is accessible and always providing that is manipulated.
And has that change in genetics that happened to these forest people been continuous to modern times?
We think it is one of the biggest problems that you face as a human collective today.
Now scientists today try to categorize human beings through carbon-14 dating, radiocarbon dating, for example, and sometimes determine that they're finding remains of human beings or other species that were, let's say, some 250,000 years ago. How is it possible for them to radiocarbon date something to 250,000 years if there was a timeline shift 13,000 years ago? Or is it because the fifth dimension has been continuous since prior to 250,000 years?
Well, this is a material consideration that you must always take into account, because science on your planet today has not intersected with the energetics of universal law and how that applies on a physical material planet, even though it is focused in physical and material things. So the science has not evolved to the point where those that are performing these types of tests would understand that the shift in timeline and dimension must be accounted for. It could never actually become a mathematical determination. In other words, even your own lifetimes, you believe that you are living to a certain age because you are calculating that age based on the confines of the definition that humans have put on time. When in fact, we don't necessarily see you living to the limitations of any age that could be based on years even minutes, hours, and days. We think the way you perceive your life and the longevity of your life is actually going to determine how old you live to, and could change the confines of how you define time at all. So all of these considerations must come into the equation.
So is it fair to say that any radiocarbon date that places remains prior to, let's say, 9 to 13,000 years ago is incorrect?
It isn't necessarily all incorrect, yet may not be providing the most accurate determination in every case.
Okay. These forest people that we were discussing in this conversation, were they, as science refers to today, the same species, Homo sapiens sapien, let's say, as we are today?
Slightly different in their presentation, but nonetheless closer in their presentation to you than you might believe.
So they weren't another species like Neanderthals or something like that. They were very close to us.
Well, what you have to keep in mind is that the humans who were originally seated on planet Earth were meant to evolve beyond interference, yet that was not the case. So, if you go back to ancient periods, what you may notice is that human beings looked a bit differently in their size, in their skin color, even in the thickness of skin or the thickness of hair. Even for periods in the past, what we have determined is humans have become more like their hybrid cosmic families, looking more like the animals that you know today than humans at all. But in the timeline that you speak of, we want to be very clear in that we don't necessarily see a primate type of manifestation of humans. We see more of a purebred human in more of a native presentation.
I see. This genetic modification that occurred to the forest people, did those forest people continue into the current third dimensional timeline and proliferate? Are we the descendants of those
Well,
forest
they
people?
are a part of your ancestry. You are all carrying the history and the genetic predisposition of these beings.
And so, in that context, do we still possess the same genetic modification that they had that caused them to want to become workers for the Anunnaki? Or to
Me-
look up to others, for example, for their own source?
you do in many respects, yet it is important to clarify that so many of you are beginning to not only heal that genetic limitation, but break the confines through which it has held you in a very restricted state.
I noticed that in modern times, for example, a lot of politicians, like the President of the United States, when they're standing up there and professing what they're going to do for their nation, one of the main points is always they're going to create jobs for everybody. But I always found that to be a little interesting that this individual is promising jobs and that people actually who follow the economy think that's a positive. But the whole idea of a job is very similar to the Anunnaki timeline, where these individuals who are um, uh, basically living a very balanced, harmonious life in nature went from that to then relying on someone to create a job for them that really has little to do with, I mean, in a manner of speaking, I suppose all of our souls were having our journey, but it seems like it's out of harmony with our higher potential.
Well, the very idea that a representative of anything is going to create a job for anyone else, it goes against the laws of nature. And if we are to look at the tribe you are speaking of, that the Anunnaki did its initial research on, we might say that they were creating the life that they were here to ultimately express, meaning each one of them came with a specific purpose, very distinct, than distinctly different even than any other. And the tribe learned to honor this at a very early age, even though the ancestors would pass down to future generations what they had learned in the passage of their life. The future generations of the tribe were brought up with the idea that they were meant to express their uniquest talent in a way that others would benefit from, such that they could become not only fulfilled, but a very meaningful part of the community. And that is ultimately what has been lost. Human beings are not feeling a sense of purpose in the world. There is nothing meaningful in the job that they are choosing if it is ultimately created for them. Everyone is here to live in the fullness of their own divine plan and create according to it.
In ancient times, and even into the recent many thousands of years, Enlil was represented by the horned bull. And I find it interesting that the bull today is used in Wall Street, for example, or to represent the financial system. It seems to me that the whole slavery mindset that was integrated into our genetics of the forest people that we are the descendants of also could be responsible for the whole financial system, which of course the Anunnaki were mining for gold. And the golden horned bull is the representation of Enlil, which still is today representing finance in the markets and things like that. Is the whole financial structure of the world essentially a descendant of Anunnaki creation?
Well, we think this seems very obvious, and what we prefer to describe this as is the synchronicity of the universe, showing you the actual origins of what is being created. It is not to say that every symbol like this has ancient meaning, yet, if you are to remember that you are here as conscious representatives of a collective reality, here to co-create something different, you are always going to see the road signs that are going to lead you down the paths that exist beyond what has limited you before. So these synchronicities and symbols are perhaps even a gift, we might say, offering you a window of explanation into not only their origins, but how they are continued to be influenced in ways that expand them in modern times.
Now, here we find ourselves again in a time when we're going from third back to fifth dimension, but there's also a lot of genetic manipulation that's happening on the planet similar to the forest people. Now, first of all, I'd like to understand, is that being done at this time because those who are of the Anunnaki bloodline who rule the world realize that humanity in some way is elevating to higher consciousness and therefore, in a manner of speaking, rewriting their genetics to step outside of this job worker slave mentality where we have to look to those outside of us for source.
Well, it isn't necessarily that there is any purpose in terms of recent awakening that is the motivating factor behind what you speak of. This has been a constant in the timeline experiences that humanity has been replaying since the origins of these periods. Yet, we always remind those who come to these transmissions that those who are highly advanced in terms of understanding universal law or working with energy have the ability to tap into the collective pulse and understand where not only astrological influences may be affecting the creative potential of what is preparing to manifest, or how humans are actually awakening deliberately on the physical plane to what is happening in a material sense. And we think the urgency to reinstate the Anunnaki genome or to somewhat perpetuate only a certain genetic predisposition within your race is coming from fear. It's coming from a period of time where certainly the awakening has been so great that humans are not subscribing to many of the old tactics that have been used before. And that is going to take a new level of focus and commitment of these beings in order to keep humans in a very stagnant reality. Some of you call it a matrix, even, where you have the inability to see beyond a certain set of rules. Yet, our insight is that the train that has now taken off from the station is moving at such a rapid pace in terms of consciousness and awakening that we do not think it can be stopped. Meaning, you will be experiencing the dichotomy of two timeline experiences, very much like going back to the time when Atlantis was present on the planet and the Anunnaki came. It is almost like a reverse, a complete and total reverse of that timeline back to the restoration of enlightened times.
And so that's why the urgency for all the various vaccines and darkening the sun and those various agendas are all concentrated all of a sudden this decade.
Yes, it is an urgency that is being manifested through fear.
And is there any way to even quantify a timeline or a period of linear time during which this intensity of experience may persist before we start to see the, say, light at the end of the tunnel, sort of?
We cannot determine it, and this is why. All of you are the ones that are responsible for co-creating the experience that you are having together. Meaning the timeline can speed up or it can slow down. It can accelerate or it can stall. But it is through the contribution of every human choice and the ascension of their energy that is going to determine the outcome.
So when you say choice, are you referring to physical choice? Let's say, for example, maybe I choose to quit my job and work for myself doing something that I love versus looking for my source through someone else.
We think that physical choice is just as important as energetic considerations, as these are choices too, meaning how you view the world and everything you intersect with as an energetic being is going to be an important part of this ascension timeline. Just as we mentioned, the environment that you cultivate within which the DNA is able to function is a more physical determination. Your energetic structure is very much the same. So the frequencies that you invite in, the energetics that you are deciding to intersect with, all of those things also come into consideration.
Now, we've discussed before how the reptilian consciousness is what sort of started us in this descending of consciousness throughout ancient times, which we haven't really delved into that, and I don't want to get too in-depth into that in this conversation. We'll come back to that in another one. But we just discussed in the last several conversations about the Anunnaki timeline, and so how does the Anunnaki timeline, in a manner of speaking, interface with the reptilian consciousness? Considering it seems pretty obvious that all of modern society around the world today is Anunnaki in nature. So is a way to connect those two ideas essentially that the Anunnaki timeline is more physical, whereas reptilian is more of a consciousness or vibration?
Well, we think that the connection can actually be made very similarly within the genome, meaning that you are all hybrids. You have been seeded by intergalactic races throughout this universe. And for this very purpose, access to that genome is something that intergalactic beings are very interested in, much like the reptilians. Now, where the Anunnaki may be focused on more material types of endeavors, we think the reptilian involvement is more of a conscious type of technology, meaning they are attempting to skew your DNA by actually manipulating the physical structure through which it manifests. This is a very long discussion, and we know you want to keep it short, but this has to do with the mechanics of the mind and how the mind interfaces with other aspects of your divine structure, like the emotional body, your spiritual body, in the physical. And all of these things together are meant to create in concert a life that is free and also purposeful. But whenever a race, for example, like the reptilians, who also experienced a great cataclysm, are in very close proximity on a planet to another race, the genetics of that race are going to become influenced. And the reptilian DNA within you, which is accessing a more enhanced mind, has actually dominated and focused you through the mind in a way that is not progressive and not supporting your ascension. So it is similar in some respects, even though it's slightly different in its presentation.
So I want to just sort of sidetrack for a moment and revisit our earlier conversation, and then we'll wrap it up for today. We were discussing how these forest people, who we are the descendants of, existed, were actually very similar in appearance to how we are today, but maybe a bit more like Native American appearing than we are today. Now, modern scientists seem to periodically discover the remains of different, what they refer to as species of beings. Like, for example, the Piltdown Man, which was shown to be a hoax later on, where they grafted an ape to some human body parts. Recently, also, there was a special on Netflix where they apparently discovered a new being who is some sort of ape-like with a human, which they are saying is an actual being that we are a descendant of. So essentially, connecting us to an ape-like being. First of all, have we ever, in human evolution, ever commingled, or rather descended from apes, or were we always in an advanced human form from our original seeding till modern times, perhaps genetically modified a bit along the way, but are apes and that whole family of different beings entirely different from the human lineage?
We don't necessarily see humans being made manifest from primates. In other words, we see these as two distinctly different types of beings that were seeded on the human planet. And the very beginning of the human seeding brought hybrids to the planet. And this is why often in ancient history you see depictions of beings that look very similar to the mix of a human with an animal like a primate. It is more the reflection of a hybrid presentation of that DNA as opposed to human. And the human beings that you are an evolutionary manifestation of those original hybrids. Now, in saying much of what we've talked about in this transmission in terms of the suppression of your DNA and your genome, we are not by any means alluding to the fact that you are unevolved as a species where you stand today. In fact, we think even though there has been the suppression of the DNA, humans have evolved in terms of their diversity in such profound ways. And that is one of the blessings of the entire timeline that we speak of is that regardless of any manipulation, regardless of whatever race has been manipulated, there's always an intelligence to the process, meaning the DNA, it is programmed to rise above that manipulation and continue to thrive. And even today, you see so many strengths within the human body and how the human presentation has taken on the beauty of the original intention of the seeders. So much of what you're experiencing in modern science, for example, and some of the media that you are speaking of has more to do with assumptions that are being made or intentional corruption that is being put into the field.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, and let me know if I'm on the wrong track, human beings as we are today have more or less looks very similar from our original seeding.
Yes, we believe that to be the case.
Okay. And primates were entirely different, and were also seeded originally in that as primates.
Yes.
So all of these connections that science is making to us having come from apes is either scientific immaturity or maybe an actual agenda to diminish the value of human beings?
In many cases, yes, not at all.
Okay. So what are the other cases?
There are some that are simply misled by the prophecies of others.
So if evolution exists, such as the Darwinian theory of evolution, then is there even evolution of the beings that were originally seeded, or do they all still pretty much look the same as they did in the original seeding?
Well, evolution is not necessarily physically focused at all, and this is a misnomer, we believe, that has to be cleared up. While certainly the desire on a physical planet is to become the most resilient and highest manifestation of physical form possible, you are attempting to evolve through self-knowing. And we cannot harp on this enough as we bring it into almost every transmission that we have done, is the understanding of self through the expression in the outer world is ultimately what leads to an evolutionary process. And in that evolutionary process, within the cosm of it, the physical body and the presentation of physical form, whether it be internal, the structure internally or externally, is also apt to improve.
Okay, thank you. We're going to stop there for today. Thank you, Micheila.
Right.
And thank you all for joining us again for another Channel Revelations. And if you want to check us out on other platforms, you can find us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or ad-free also on Rumble as well. So thank you again, and we'll see you next week for another Awaken and Part podcast.